Today's daf will start because I actually am going to review what we did at the end of the day yesterday because it's never hurts to do it twice, right? But today's daf in Masechet Zevachim on Sunday is daf Mem Bet 42. Okay, 42 in Zevachim, and today is actually not. It's a very confined daf. It talks about one subject pretty much, and the one subject is mifaglim b'chatzi matir, right? Pigo is when a person does a karban and has a thought that they're going to eat something that a person's supposed to eat, or burn something on the mizbeach, or put something on the mizbeach that's supposed to be put on the mizbeach, shelo b'chutz lizmanu, in the wrong time for that thing, either the next day or 2 days. That's pigel. But there's two very important details of pigel. One, which we'll get to later today, is that if you do pigel in one act of the karban, the rest of the karban has to be done properly, right? Meaning if you do pigel when you do shechita, you think I'm shechting this animal and I'm thinking I'm going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow. You have to then do all the next steps correctly, Kabbalah, halacha, zrika, in order for it to be a pigel animal. Otherwise, it's just a puzzle animal. That's one detail. So the rest of it has to be done properly, right? And the words are kartsaat kasher, kach hartsaat pasul, right? The way a kosher animal would have to be everything done properly, a puzzle animal, everything else has to be done properly. That's one detail. And the second detail, which is the more immediate one, is that if you're doing pigol in what's called a matir, in one act that permits the animal, you have to do maybe in that whole matir, right? So if an animal has to be sprinkled, the blood has to be sprinkled on the mizbeach, but it has to be sprinkled 4 times, then if you do pigol in one of the sprinklings, but not the other 3, then, according to the Chachamim, it's not pigol. It has to be the entire matir. And the case that we added to that yesterday was the case of a karban mincha. Because a mincha, in order for when you sprinkle it on the mizbeach or put it on the mizbeach, you put 2 things on the mizbeach. You put the levona, which is the spices, and you put the what's it called, the kemitza, which is the handful of flour. And we said in the Mishnah, Masechet Menachot, that if you think about pigol about one and not the other, then it's not pigol, according to the Chachamim, because you have to do pigol in both. Said Rebbe Meir, no, even if you have pigol in one and not in the other, it's still pigol, right? So one explanation of Rebbe Meir, the easiest explanation, is that he holds you could be a pigol with even half of a matir. Even though there's 2 things that have to be done, kemitza and levona, if you have machshav in one, it makes the whole thing pigol. That's one explanation. Reish Lakish came and said, I don't like that explanation. He was medayik from our Mishnah. And he said that Rebbe Meir agrees that in order to make something pigol, you have to have a machshav about the entire matir. However, what the case in that Mishnah was where you had pigol about the first thing, and you said nothing about the second. So there, Rebbe Meir says, well, since you said nothing about the second and you had pigol on the first, kol ha'oseh al dat rishona huseh. You think about the first one when you're doing the second one. And so saying it for the first one and saying nothing for the second one, according to Rebbe Meir, is pigol for the whole thing. According to the Chachamim, it's not. And that's the machloket. So that's how Reish Lakish explained it, and we talked about that yesterday. The problem was from this Braita, which I'm going to read again, the last line of Daf Mem Aleph Amud Bet, Meitzvah. How about the following Braita, second to last line, I guess. B'med Dvarim Amurim, says the Braita, when is this true? That pigol in one part, makes the other part still pigol. When is that true? That's true about karbanot that are brought outside, like the regular chatat, because according to Beit Hillel, you only need to do 1 sprinkling of the blood. So since only 1 is necessary, if you do pigol on that one, it doesn't really matter what you do for the next 3. Aval, turn to Daf Mem Daled Amud Aleph, Mem Bet Amud Aleph. Aval, but when you have to put blood on the inside mizbeach, kigon, 43 Yom Kippurim, the 43 sprinklings of Yom Kippur, which I'm going to repeat what they are, even though I did it yesterday, because it's really important for today's daf. The 43 on Yom Kippur was that you had 2 animals, right? You had a Sa'ir Naseh Bifnim, the partner of the Sa'ir Lazazel, and you had the part of the Kohen Gadol, which was also the power of the Kohanim. So you would bring the blood from those animals inside. You would go into the Kodesh HaKadashim and sprinkle Achas Lamala and Sheva Lamata 8 times in front of the Badim of the Aron for the Par and for the Sa'ir. That's 16. You would then walk outside to the Kodesh and do the same thing towards the curtain, right, towards the Parochet, 8, 7 below and 1 above. So another 16 is 32. You would then mix the blood together and put them on each corner of the Mizbeach, which made it 36. And then you do 7 times on top of the Mizbeach, which made 43. So any of those 43, and the Achadasar Shel Par Kohen Mashiach, and the 11 of the Par Kohen Mashiach, which is the 7 of the on front of the Parochet, and the 4 on the Mizbeach, the Achadasar Shel Par Helm Davar Shel Tzibor, and the 11 of the Par Helm Davar Shel Tzibor, and in all those cases, Pigel, if you think a machshava of Pigel, whether you do it Bein B'Rishona, Bein B'Shniya, Bein B'Shlishit, whether you do it, and now we understand this to mean about Yom Kippur, whether the first set, meaning the set you do in the Kodesh HaKadashim, or the Shniya, the second set, which you do in the Kodesh towards the Parochet, or the Shlishit, or the third set that you do on the Mizbeach HaZahav, the Mizbeach on the inside, which are 3 different sets, Rabbi Meir says Pigol. In all of those cases, as long as you had a machshava about one set, it's Pigol, v'chayavin alav karet, and the Chachamim omrim ein bo karet ad shifaga b'chal matir. Chachamim say it would only be Pigol if you had a machshava of Pigol on all 43, right? All 3 sets. But according to Rabbi Meir, one set is enough. Now the problem with this, according to Reish Lakish, is that sure, if you had a machshava in the first set and did nothing for number 2 and number 3, that would be Pigol. But according to Reish Lakish, if you didn't have a machshava pigol in the first set, and you only had it in the second set or the third set, that's not enough to make it pigol. And so this Braita, Katani Miyad, it says, pigol bein b'rishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shlishit, upalig, and Rabbi Meir argues. So how does Reish Lakish explain this Braita? Says Rav Yitzchak bar Avin, you mistake the whole Braita, because the Braita confused you. Now, we're going to get rid of this answer, but let me just explain it. Because when we were talking in our Mishnah about Pigol, we were talking about Pigol when you sprinkle the blood, and you have, say, 4 sprinklings, or 41 sprinkle, 43, and one time you do it for Pigol, and one time you don't do it for Pigol. Here, we're not talking about where you did Pigol with the sprinkling of the blood. We're talking about where you did Pigol with the Shechita, right? A whole different act of the Karban, meaning you did Shechita of the animal, and you thought when you did the Shechita, I'm going to sprinkle the blood in the wrong place, or the wrong time, let's just say. So there, the act of Shechita is the first act of the Karban. So whether you thought, when I shech the animal, I'm going to sprinkle the first set of blood for Pigol, or I thought I'm going to sprinkle the second blood for Pigol, or the third, it doesn't matter, because the Shechita itself is a full matir. So it says Rav Yitzchak bar Avin, Hachma Eskin Egon Shepigol b'Shechita. You did Pigol in the act of Shechita about the blood, right? And Dichad Matiru. The Shechita is its own matir. Says the Gemara, one second, Ihachi my tamid Rabbanan. So if that's the case, why would the Rabbanan argue? Meaning, if when you did the act of Shechita, you were thinking, I want to do this for Pigol, and everything else in the Karban was done properly, why would the Chachamim argue? Now, I just want to add one more detail that I didn't put in so clearly here, which is that part of the reason, and we're going to, again, unpack this more as we go today, part of the reason that we have 3 sections of the Malacha of Dam on Yom Kippur is because of an interesting halacha that we had back in Yuma, which is that if, let's say, a person shechs the sa'ir, right, and takes the blood in a container, goes into the Beit Kodesh HaKadashim, sprinkles it 7 and 4 times, right, and then the blood spills out. You lose the blood. So what do you do then? So you have to get another animal, remember, another sa'ir, stand it up in its place, and shecht a new sa'ir. You know, machlok about whether you need another sa'ir lazazel, but let's just talk about the sa'ir or even the par, where you obviously don't need another one. And you start, now the Mishnah says in Yuma, you don't start over. You don't have to start from the beginning. You actually get credit for what you already did, right? Let's say you already did the first set 11. You then take the blood from the new par and start doing the next step. So basically it's units of 1, 2, and 3. But if you had pigol in the shechita of any of those animals, that should be a complete pigol, right? So ask the Gemara, Ihachi, my time.
43 animals? Yeah, 43 animals?
No.
Take another animal?
So I'm trying to be a little loose on it, but let's just say there's 3 animals, right? Because you can do, I mean, of course, it wasn't common for them to spill the blood, but let's assume that you go back and you do the beginning of that section, right? So there's the inside, the Kodesh HaKodashim, there's the Parochet, and there's the Mizbeach. There's 3, first, second, and third groups of this. Ask the Gemara, Hachi my time Rabbanan. So now if you're changing the whole Braita, not to be talking about where you're sprinkling blood, 5 times or 40 times, and you're having a thought in one sprinkling and not in the other, you're talking about an act of shechita. Why would the Rabbanan argue that if you shech the karban with an intention of sprinkling the blood chutz lizmano or doing something chutz lizmano, why in the world wouldn't that be pigol? Amar Rava, says Rava, it's because, now this is why you could see it's a little bit of a dochik here, is that according to Rav Yitzchak Ravan's opinion, you'd have to explain that the Chachamim in this Braita are Reb Eliezer it's the opinion of Reb Eliezer, it's not. Now, Reb Eliezer is an opinion which is not related to Pigel at all. The question of Reb Eliezer is that there is a halacha, a separate halacha, which is that if you do a korban outside of the Beit HaMikdash, you're chayiv, right? It's called shchutei chutz. You're not allowed to do a korban that is equivalent to what you would do for Hashem outside of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, that's not only an animal, of course. It's any korban that you do inside. If you do it the equivalent outside the Beit HaMikdash, you would be chayiv. So says the Mishnah later, Ditznan, now this is a Mishnah much, much later, hakometz. Let's say you take a mincha and you take a kometz and you put it outside and burn it on a mizbeach outside the Beit HaMikdash, or levona, or you burn the spices, or the ketoret, right, from the regular korban of the Kohen of the ketoret, or minchat kohanim. Remember a special mincha that the Kohen brought on the day that they first became a Kohen, right? They would bring the minchat kohanim, or the minchat Kohen Mashiach, or the mincha of the Kohen. Remember, the Kohen had to bring mincha every day. Minchat chavitim, it was called. Uminchat nisachim, or you bring the mincha that's brought along with karbanot. Remember, like we say on Musaf and every chag, right? The nisachim that you brought with the mincha. In any of those cases, says the Mishnah later, sheikriv me'achat me'hem kazayit b'chutz chayav. If you take from that mincha that's supposed to be done in the Beit HaMikdash, and you take it, and you take part of it, not the whole thing, but you take a kizayit of it, and you take it outside the Beit HaMikdash, and you put it on a mizbeach, in Tel Aviv, then you're chayav for shchutei chutz, because you did a kizayit. That's the mainstream opinion. And Rebbe Eliezer poter. Rebbe Eliezer comes up with this novel opinion that you're poter from shchutei chutz if you only did a kizayit, because says Rebbe Eliezer, ad sheyakriv et kulam. It's not called an act unless you do all of them, right? Meaning, unless you do the entire matir, so that you take the entire kometz or the entire levona or the entire, whatever it is, and you do it on the mizbeach outside, then it's not called an act of avoda. In order to be called an act of avoda, you have to do the entire thing. Says the Gemara now, according to Rebbe Eliezer, there's a whole new innovation. So now comes Yom Kippur, right? The Kohen Gadol brings the par, he spills the blood, so he brings the second par. He spills the blood, he brings the third par, right? And that's what we're calling Rishonah, Shniyah, and Shlishit. He brings a par for the first set of blood, a par for the second set, a par for the third set. He shechs that one of those parim and has a thought of pigel, whether it's the first, the second, or the third. According to the Chachamim, it should be pigel, because an act of shechita is a complete act. Introduces Rebbe Eliezer this new concept that it's only called avoda if you do the entire thing. And since here you basically need 3 karbanot to make 1 karban, you need 3 shchita of the par to make 1 full karban. According to Rebbe Eliezer, thinking a thought about one of the shchitas would not be pigel for the whole shchita, because it's only called shchita, according to Rebbe Eliezer, if you do the entire act. And since the entire act involves all 3 parim, according to Rebbe Eliezer, it would not be pigel because you didn't do a whole shchita. So again, nothing to do with this question of matir kemitzvato or pigol b'chatzi matir. It's because Rebbe Eliezer has this novel opinion that you don't call an act of avoda unless you do the entire act. And since on this weird case in Yom Kippur, you would need 3 shchitas, any pigol about one of them would not make pigol the entire animal. So that's the explanation of this braita. Says the Gemara.
Where do we get three sacrifice on Yom Kippur? The Kohen has one for the community, one for himself. Then you have Azazel, and so
no.
3 of them.
So I want to clarify. So we're talking about a case where there was 3 karbanot done for 1, meaning the Kohen brought his par, the Kohen Gadol brought the par. He then spilled the blood of the par. He spilled it out, meaning he lost the blood. It got ruined.
He has to spill it on the bottom of the altar.
No.
It's normal.
No, it spilled it out in the garbage. It spilled by mistake. So the Kohen Gadol stepped on the thing, and it spilled out on the floor.
All this in steps, so and it's very hard to follow.
Okay, so I'll say it again from the beginning. Hopefully, it'll clarify it all. The Kohen Gadol walked into the Azara. He shechted his par on Yom Kippur. He accepted the blood in a kos. He walked into the Kodesh Hakadashim. He sprinkled 7 times, 7 and 1, right? 8 times in the Kodesh Hakadashim. He then picks up the container to walk out to the Kodesh, and he spills the whole thing. So he lost all the blood. So then the halacha is he's got to go back to the Azara, get a new par. Hopefully they had a backup ready, shecht a new one. bring the blood back in. He doesn't have to start from the beginning. He does not have to do the 8 that he already did. He has to start from the middle, right? He now starts sprinkling on in front of the parochet in the Kodesh. Same thing happens again. He does 7 above and 1 below, one above, 7 below, and then he spills the whole thing of blood again. He's got to go out to the Azara and find a new par and shech the third par. And now he brings a third par, and he takes the blood from the third par and does the remaining sprinkling of the blood on the Mizbeach HaZahav in this case. So here we have a case where there's a Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur has shechted 3 parim in the place of 1. We explained that the Braita was then saying, in this case, if you have a thought of pigul in either the first par or the second par or the third par, it would be pigul. And we explained, why is that pigul? Because you had a thought of pigul in the act of shchita. And the act of shchita is a complete act. And so therefore, whether it's the first act or the second one or the third one, it would be pigul. So we asked, why then do the Chachamim say it's not pigul, if it's talking about shchita? And we answered, it's Rebbe Eliezer. Because Rebbe Eliezer says that even an act of shchita is only considered to be a complete act of shchita if it's the entire act of the animal. And since this carbon of par of Yom Kippur, this specific case needed 3 animals, you have to have a thought by all 3. And unless you have a thought of pigul by all 3 shchitas, even a thought of pigul in 1 shchita would not be enough to make it pigul. Ask the Gemara, V'amar Rava, that's what we're up to now, says Rava, but we know that Rebbe Eliezer, although he holds that in order to be an act of bringing something on Mizbech, you have to do the whole thing, he doesn't say that about blood. Moda Rebbe Eliezer, I think it is, Rebbe Elazar, it says in mine, Moda Rebbe Elazar bidamim, right? Rebbe Eliezer admits that by the blood, you actually don't have to do the entire blood for it to be an avodah. It's not because the Mishnah Numa says that Rebbe Eliezer, Rebbe Shimon Omrim, mimakom shepasak misham hu matriel. That wherever the Kohen Gadol was up to, when he spilled out the blood, and he had to go find new blood by shechting a new par, he starts from that point. He doesn't have to go back to the beginning. Right? So even Rebbe Eliezer is of the opinion that unlike bringing karbanot outside the Beit HaMikdash, when you're talking about sprinkling blood, you just pick it up from wherever you started, in which case an act of sprinkling blood should be a complete act. So you can't explain the Braita that way. Elamar Rava says, Rava, okay, let's forget, you just forget everything you just learned about Rebbe Eliezer. Don't really forget it, because it's going to be important later in the Masechta, but it has nothing to do with this Braita. The Braita is a regular case like we thought in the beginning, where the Kohen Gadol has the blood, and he's sprinkling the blood, and the question is, he's having a thought of pigul while he's sprinkling the blood. The Braita said that whether he's pigul in the first set, Rishonah, or the second or the third set, it's pigul. We asked, according to Reish Lakish, that doesn't make any sense, because according to Reish Lakish, it's in Rebbe Meir, it's only pigul if you have a machshava in the beginning, in the first set, and then you're quiet for the second and third set. Says Rava, that's exactly what the Braita means. Elama Rava, what the Braita really means is kigon, what the Braita means, where are we, 7 lines on the bottom, shepigel b'rishona, you actually had a thought of pigul in the first set of blood. And then you were shatak b'shniya, you didn't say anything in the second set, the chazar v'pigel b'shlishit, and then you said, I want to do it for pigel in the third set. So now the chachamim come along and say, that's not pigel, because since you were quiet in the second set, you didn't do all of the zrika for pigel. Says Rebbe Meir, you're chayav, because we always go back with what you said initially. When you're quiet, we look at what you said immediately before that. What's the chiddush? Why is this? Why is he telling us this? Because Ma'adatema, I would have thought, look, if it's really true that after you said it pigul on the first one, everything you do after that is pigul, why'd you say it by the third one, right? If you always are like, everything I said before continues, so if I said pigul with the first set, the second set I was quiet, according to Rabbi Meir, now that's pigul, why do you then say by the third set, I want to do this for pigul? Pigula b'shlishit lamali. Why did you speak out by the third set? I want to do pigul. So maybe the fact that you spoke out by the third set that you wanted to do it pigul, it tells you basically that he didn't want to do pigul for the second set. Kamash Malan says Rava that Rabbi Meir is telling you that no, you just said it that way. Sometimes people talk, sometimes they don't talk. You can't conclude from the fact that he said, I want to do the third set for pigul, that he meant I wanted to do the second set not for pigul. And therefore you'd be chayiv. Matkif Rav Ashi, said Rav Ashi, that's a very difficult reading of this Braita. because you're reading the Braita to be, you did pigo in the first, you were quiet in the second, you did pigo in the third. It does not say the word quiet in the Braita. Midi shatakatani. Does it say in the Braita that you were quiet and you had no specific thought about the second one? It doesn't say that. Elam Ravashi says, Ravashi, this is how you have to understand the Braita. It's not so different than Rava, but let me give a little more nuance. Hacha b'maya skinan. The case of the Braita has to be, we are now 4 lines from the bottom of Daf Mem Bet Amud Aleph. Hacha b'maya skinan kigon. The case is shepigel b'rishona b'shniya uv'shlishit. Right? The case is where you did pigel in the first group of blood, the second group of blood, and the third group of blood. But of course, what we neglected to tell you till now is that there's a fourth group of blood, right? Of course. And meaning, what's the fourth group of blood? And when you're done with all 3 parts, right, you actually put it on top of the Mizbeach, right? So the first part, just to be clear, is Lifnai v'Lifnim in the Kodesh Kodashim. The second one is in front of the Parochet. The third one is on the corners of the Mizbeach. But after you do the corners of the Mizbeach, the fourth set is when you sprinkle it actually on top of the Mizbeach, right? And that part you didn't say anything about. So the Braita left that out, but you thought about the first, the second, the third. You said nothing about the fourth. So now, according to the Chachamim, since you said nothing about the fourth, it's not pigel, because you didn't do everything with pigel. According to Rabbi Meir, according to Rish Lakish, the fact is that you did pigel for the first 3. It continues forward to the fourth. But says Rav Ashi, I would have thought, if it's really true that as you keep going, you're relying on your earlier thoughts, then why did you have to say, why would you have said, I want the first one to be pigel, I want the second one to be pigel, I want the third one to be pigel? That starts making me feel like maybe you have to say pigel in order for it to be pigel, right? How do you know that even though you didn't say it by the fourth, it's still pigel? Kamash Malan, that, sometimes that's what happens. People don't say it by each one, but they really mean it by all of them. So that's Rav Ashi's explanation of the Braita. It does not mean you can be chayiv pigel for 1, 2, or 3. It means you're chayiv pigel even if you do 1, 2, and 3. But you would have been even better if you just did number 1. Ask the Gemara now on top of Daf Membet on a bet.
But what is the pigel here?
What do you mean? What's the pigel?
Well, normally when we're talking about pigel, we were saying that he would do something chutz zman. So therefore, he has now, and he's going to eat it then the next day. So this is Yom Kippur. Well,
he's going to burn it. Eat? No, he's going to burn it.
No, I mean, what's he thinking about eating?
He's not thinking about eating.
Or 2 hours later, 6 hours later.
He's not thinking about eating. He's thinking about burning. You don't eat the carbon on Yom Kippur.
Exactly.
He's thinking about burning it. Remember, eating means either human eating or Mizbeach eating, right? So if you have a thought that I'm going to burn the parts on the Mizbeach, they're supposed to be burnt tomorrow instead of today, that's pigel. So obviously, on Yom Kippur, there's no part that's eaten by the
absolutely. So that's why I'm wondering, what is the pigel?
So that's the answer.
But even burning on Yom Kippur, you got the whole community waiting. Why would he be burning it 2 days later or the next day?
That's a great question.
I mean, I'm trying to figure out what is the pigel on Yom. Okay, if it brings out no ordinary korban on Tuesday and says I'm going to do it Thursday, but this is Yom Kippur. So where's the pigel? I don't understand what the pigel is.
So just to be clear, I think you do. The pigel is he's having a thought. I'm sprinkling this on condition, or the thought that I'm going to burn it tomorrow instead of today. Your question is, how would that ever happen? That's a great question. You can ask that about almost everything we talk about. But that's the question of
not exactly. This is Yom Kippur. It's different.
Right. So here that's the question of pigel. And according to Rav Ashi's reading in the Braita of Rabbi Meir, according to the understanding of Rish Lakish, it means his thought was the first and the second and the third, and not the fourth. And the chiddush is that even though you actually seem to be talking about it all the time, when you don't say it, you just go back to what you said before. Ask the Gemara on top of my mem bet on a bet, but that's not what the words of the Braita said, right? The Braita said, Bein berishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shlishit, or, not and, right? Either. Bein means between this one or that one or that one. Says Markasha, you're right. Those words do not seem to support this, but it's sometimes the Braita is inexact or you read it differently, but that's the way you'd have to sort of explain the Braita according to Reish Lakish in Rabbi Meir. Now,
is this all part of the 43?
This is all part of the 43, yeah.
But you said the 43 are broken up into 3 groups. So what's
the Gemara unpacks this.
Now we're 46, 48?
That's a machloket. We'll get to there in a second. No, but of the 43, there are actually 4 groups. So we're breaking into 4 groups now.
So what are the four groups?
There might be a fifth group. We'll see in a second. Amar
So where
Mar.
do you break it up now? Before it was 11 and 6 and 7 or whatever it was. I don't know. I
So,
already
so the,
forgot.
the first group would be the Kodesh HaKodashim, which is 8 times 2 is 16. The second group would be the ones you put in front of the parochet, which is again 8 times 2 is 16. The third group is when you mix the blood together. Remember, you mix the par and the sa'ir, and you put it on each corner of the mizbeach. That would be the third group. The fourth group would be the 7 that you put on top of the mizbeach. We'll see in a second that there might be a fifth group
Why are you multiplying by 2?
because there's a par and a sa'ir. There's 2 carbonot.
Okay, all right.
Amar Mar. Now says the Gemara. Let's just quote what Rabbi Meir said earlier. Rabbi Meir Omer Pigul v'chayavin avlav karet. This is a very, I'll say, esoteric Gemara, but meaning it's going to be a little hard to understand. Ava, you got this. That Rabbi Meir says that it's Pigul and your chayav karet. Now says the Gemara. I'm a little confused by the whole concept. This is really a question about the whole concept of Pigul, because the truth is, if you recall that when we talk about Pigul, right? Remember, the halacha I opened with today, which is super important, is that let's say a person shechs an animal, and when they shech the animal, they think, I'm going to eat it in 3 days, right? That is pigul. But it's only pigul if they do the rest of the animal properly. They do the halacha, the kabbalah, the zrika, the burning. They have to do up to the zrika. They have to do it properly, right? Because you have to do the rest of it. It's called yikruvu kol matirav. Now, the question is, let's say you have a karban that needs 4 sprinklings of blood. Okay. So if you sprinkle the first bit of blood and you do it for a thought of pigul, right? According to Rabbi Meir, that's pigul in your chayav karet, even though you don't have a thought about the next part of blood. In Yom Kippur, right? Let's say you do the first segment of blood with pigul, you sprinkle in front of the Kodesh HaKodashim in the Aron with the thought of pigul. The rest, the whole animal is pigul, but it means you've got to take the blood, go outside, sprinkle the rest of it in front of the parochet, put the rest of it on the mizbeach, or else it's not pigul because you didn't finish, right? But says the Gemara, the problem with us with Yom Kippur is michti karet lo mechayev. You're not chayev karet for a thought of pigul ad sheyikruvu kol matirav until you do the rest of the karban properly, right? Damar mar, because we have this statement that we've had many times before. Now quote, "Kartzaat kasher." Kach hartza'at pasul, that the hartza'ah, the I don't know, suitability of a kosher animal is like the suitability of a pasul animal. Meaning, and this is the statement before, ma hartza'at kasher. Just like for an animal to be kosher, you don't say you finish your karban unless you do all of the parts that you have to do. Achi yikruvu kol matirav, until you bring all the parts that are required, which is really just the zrika. But until you bring up to the zrika. Av hartza'at pasul ad sheyikruvu kol matirav. You'd have to bring all the blood for the zrika. The problem with Yom Kippur that we're asking now is that since there's essentially sections in the avodah of the karban, kivan dechashiv befnim psula. Since you say, Rabbi Meir, that as soon as you had a thought about pigul for the inside karbanot, it's inside sprinkling, it's pasul, then the animal is going to be pasul. Kimandelo adidami. It's as if there is no animal left behind, right? Not no blood, no animal, but no blood really, right? Because the animal becomes pasul. It's like mayim, it's like water. So then kihadar mati behechal, when you go back and you sprinkle it in the hechal for step 2 or step 3, maya ba'amud kamadi. It's like you're doing water. Meaning, if you've pasuled the animal with the first step of the pigul, how could the second step and the third step be considered doing the rest of it properly? Right? Now, this is a very subtle question because you could ask this question, of course, about every single karban. But the difference between every karban and Yom Kippur is that most karbanot are one step, right? All the sprinkling of the blood is sort of done together. But on Yom Kippur, we've split this up into different sets, right? So how could you do it on Yom Kippur? Says Rabbah, I'll explain to you how you do it. You could talk about Yom Kippur where you have 4 different parim and 4 different siirim. Meaning, it's conceivable that after you did the sprinkling of the blood on step 1, and you thought in your mind, I'm doing this, or you said, I'm doing this for pigul, it's true that if you then took that blood outside and sprinkled it, it would be as if you did nothing. But you, by mistake, spilled out the blood. So you brought a new karban, and the blood of the new karban has never had a thought of pigul about it. So it's essentially like every other karban. That's Rabbah's answer. Rava says, I don't think you have to be that exaggerated. Afilu tema bepar echad v'sa'ir echad. I actually think that even with one par and one sa'ir, meaning no blood was spilled out, nothing was redone, lepigulo miratzeh. Says Rava, in fact, I don't think that that blood becomes like water, right? Because even though, according to Rebbe Meir, having a thought of pigol in that first act will make the animal pigol, it doesn't mean that that animal is totally not a kosher and not a proper animal. It's an animal for pigol, right? Just like with every regular karban, meaning Rav is attacking the distinction between a regular karban and Yom Kippur and saying that although Yom Kippur is done, quote unquote, in stages, there aren't really stages. We've made up these stages. In fact, it's one animal, and the fact that you had a machshava pigol does not mean that if you keep doing the karban, you're not doing the karban properly. So as long as you keep going and doing the rest of the karban, it is as if you're doing the rest of the karban properly, and it would be a chiyuv of pigol. A very subtle difference in machloket, but one that sort of is very interesting in terms of pigol.
Once if you accept the premise that pigo occurs with the first animal, the first daughter, the first part of it, or whatever part it is, why aren't you done then? Because why do you bring more animals? The whole thing is done. Pigo is already done, so you can't go any further. The guy's already chayiv.
Right, 100%.
So there's no reason to bring a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a tenth. You're done. Pigo is done.
100%. That's exactly the question. What he's saying is either you didn't stop, right? You could have been done. Remember, the Kohen's not doing the right thing here. Let's be very clear, right? You could have been, if had the Kohen stopped at that point, just to be clear, the Kohen Gadol said, oh my goodness, I had a thought of Pigol with the first act I did. Let me stop and start over. Then it wouldn't be Pigol, just to be clear. I mean, it would be puzzle, but it wouldn't be Pigol. It's only pigol if the Kohen Gadol either doesn't tell anybody or doesn't care enough and doesn't say to others, I had a thought of pigol, and he does the rest of the karban properly, including if the blood spills out, he goes over. Maybe he was embarrassed to say it. Or maybe he's a Russia, right? Maybe he's doing it on purpose. So he did the first act with pigol, right? He didn't tell anyone, or no one cares enough, let's just say. And he then says, I'm going to keep going, right? So there, the animal would be pigol, and you'd be chayiv karet for eating it.
But
Right.
how can that be? We learned Rashi, and you made this point because we looked at this, that if he doesn't say it out loud, Rashi says bepeh. We looked at that. So if he doesn't say it, we don't know that it's pigo because he didn't say anything. Machshava is not sufficient according to that Rashi we saw.
Right, but he's in the remember, he's in the so again, it could be a case where nobody cares, right? But whatever. I mean, again, you can always ask the question, how could a Kohen Gadol be doing pigol on Yom Kippur, right? It doesn't make any sense, but obviously that's the case we're dealing with. But the bottom line is that let's say he keeps going and finishes the animal, then it's pigol and you're chayiv karet. If he didn't finish it, you would not be chayiv karet. That's true about any pigol, right? So, meaning, just one last example. Let's say you shecht an animal with the thought, I'm going to eat this in 3 days. And then you catch yourself like, oh my God, that's the wrong thing to say, right? I just have to eat it today. And you don't do the next steps. You don't do Kabbalah, Allah, and Zrika. It's not pigol. It's puzzle, but it's not pigol. So anyways, that is that case. Let's keep going. We are up to, counting over here. Where are we up to? I don't know, it's around 10 lines from the top of this short daf. Arba'im v'shlosha, right? We said there are 43 sprinklings of blood of between the par and the sa'ir inside the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodeshim on Yom Kippur. Ask the Gemara, we said 43, but there's another Braita, Tanya Arba'im v'sheva. There's a Braita that says 47. So how do you explain 47 instead of 43? It says because if you recall, and again, I'm going to do the math really quickly because I think we've done it 10 times now, right? They did the Sa'ir and the Par in the Kodesh Kodeshim. This 8 times 2 is 16. They did the Sa'ir and the Par in front of the Prochet, 8 times 2 is 16, that's 32, okay? They did 7 on top of the Mizbeach, that's 39. So we said there were 4 more because they mixed the blood of the Par and the Sa'ir before they put it on the corner. But there's another Manda Amar in Yuma that they didn't mix the blood and that they put 4 from the Par and 4 from the Sa'ir, so you have 4 extra. Hakman Damar Marvin the Kranot. There's one opinion that says you mix the blood before you put on the corners. Hakman Damar A Marvin the Kranot. The other is if you say you don't mix the blood before the corners. I Hatanya Arba'im Shmona. There's another Braita that says 48. Where'd you get the last one, which is I call the 5th set? Hakman Damar Shirayim Makfim. What do you do at the end? Right? What do you do with the rest of the blood that has left over at the end of all the sprinklings? So Pasuk says, pour that on the Yisod of the Mizbeach. is that required or not? So one Tana holds it's ma'akev, and you have to do it. If you don't do it, it's going to passel the whole thing. You got to start over or do it again or bring another karban. Hakman damrein shirayin makvim. That would be the 48th application inside the Kodesh. Okay, so now we got all our numbers. We're up to the 2 dots, around 12 lines from the bottom. Ask the Gemara now, Meitzvei. I got a question from the following Braita. Now, this is a question, just to be clear, going back on Reish Lakish. So just to say it one more time, because everyone remembers, but I'm going to repeat it anyways. The Mishnah that we quoted from Masechet Menachot says that if you have a machshava of pigol in the kmitza and not in the kmitza, but not the levona, then it's pigol according to Rabbi Meir and not according to the Chachamim. Reish Lakish said that's not because there's pigol in half a matter. It's because there's pigol. You thought in the first thing I'm going to do pigol, and you didn't say anything about the second act. And since you didn't say anything about the second act, the thought of the first act carries forward. But if you had done it the opposite way, you had done pigol in the second act, it would not be pigol. Ask the Gemara, but there's a Braita which says very differently on that Mishnah, because this Braita says the following: when is it true that Rabbi Meir argues and says it's pigol? That's only referring to b'kmitza, the act of kmitza, or matan kli. Or remember, you do kmitza, you take out the flour, which is the equivalent of shchita, you put it into a kli, ubehiluch, and walking to the mizbeach, right? So in those 3 steps, aval balol haktara, when you come to step 4, which is actually putting the kmitza on the altar, on the mizbeach, then natanet hakometz machshava vet halevona b'shtika. If you place the kometz with the thought of pigol, and then you put the levona quietly, oh, shenatanet hakometz b'shtika, or you placed first the kometz b'shtika. Now this goes exactly against Reish Lakish. First you put the kometz quietly, and then you did the levona b'machshava of pigol. Rabbi Meir omer pigol v'chayv and lav karet. Rabbi Meir even says it's pigol. Chachamim omrim ein bo karet ad shifaga b'chol matir. But you see very clearly that it doesn't matter what order you do it. Katani miyad, either whether you do the kometz b'shtika and the levona b'machshava, then it's pigol, and Rabbi Meir is palig, right? So this goes exactly against Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish said it was only a case where you did the first step with pigol and the second step quietly. And this Braita explicitly says, even if you did the first step b'shtika and the second step quiet with machshava of pigol. Says Gemara, well, you'd have to reread the Braitas to say, no, you did it previously. Add the word previously, meaning, Ema, kfar natana telavona b'machshava. You did the kometz b'shtika, and you had already done the levona b'machshava. Says Gemara, well, then what's the chiddush? Chada, first of all, it's a problem because hainu reisha. It's the first case of the Mishnah, meaning what are you adding now? If you're not telling me that the order doesn't matter, and you first have to do the pigol, why are you saying it a second time? And furthermore, the words of the Braita do not say you already did it. Tanya, the words of the Braita are v'achar kach, and then you did it. So it's very difficult to say that the words and then mean and before. Kashya says Gemara, you're right. Those things are problematic, but Reish Lakish would have to say that that is in fact what the Braita means in order for him to understand that his interpretation is correct and that Rabbi Meir agrees with the Chachamim that there's no pigol in half of a matir, and the only reason there's pigol when you do the kometz or the levona alone is because you did it first. The other explanation, of course, the simple explanation would be that Rabbi Meir disagrees with the whole principle, and he holds you can have pigol b'chatzi matir. So that is where we leave it at the Mishnah, at the bottom of Daf Membet Amud Bet, which will pick up a whole new detail of pigol tomorrow morning. So Shavua Tov, well done. I'll see you all next week, God willing. From Portugal, hopefully. Shavua Tov.